The last time that I was trying to ask questions of you, I was saying aloud, Mayor Pete. But now this is very exciting to talk to you, and you are Secretary Buttigieg. Congratulations on your confirmation.
Thanks a lot. Really excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I think it's probably pretty neat to be the Secretary of Transportation under a president has a nickname with Amtrak in it, Amtrak Joe. It's a good time, I imagine, for your department. Tell me about what you're looking forward to doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime this would be an exciting job, but we're at a historic moment for US transportation because both parties understand the need to do more with our infrastructure. Americans have been expected to settle for less. Our bridges, our roads are crumbling. I love Amtrak, but they haven't been given the resources that other countries' train systems have to deliver higher speeds and to serve more communities. And we're getting ahead of, we're looking at technologies that we've got to get ahead of, or they're going to get ahead of us. Think about automated vehicles, think about electric vehicles. There's so much going on across the transportation space. And this is the moment, I think, to prepare us for the 2020s and really to prepare us for the rest of our lives by getting it right with a once in a lifetime historic investment in American infrastructure.
So I'd love to talk about some of those innovations because I think that there's a lot that we know we can technologically do, but I wonder how much we can realistically do. And I think the fact, for example, on electric cars, electric vehicles, it's there. We can drive a car now that was just plugged into a wall for quite some time, get us to and from work. But a lot of Americans are driving a car that they've owned for years. They're not planning on getting a new one. It's too expensive to do so. Or they're wondering, am I going to be able to charge it? Is my car going to die? And it's not going to be the process that I'm used to. How do you make things like that are technologically possible, but maybe not so realistic in right now anyway? How do you make those things possible? How do you enforce that?
Well, when you're talking about something like electric vehicles, really two things need to happen. First of all, price. We need to make sure that they are priced competitively, and the more America makes them, the more American electric vehicles will be leading the way. And remember, that's not just the sticker price of the car, but thinking about paying less on gas, probably paying less on maintenance because you're going to have fewer moving parts. There's some electric vehicles where the only fluid that goes into the whole thing is the wiper fluid. And obviously that makes it cheaper to own. But it's not just cost. Like you said, it's also range, right? Even if it's affordable, you're not going to want to take long trips in an electric vehicle if you don't know that there are charging stations along the way. It's why the president's commitment to create another 500,000 charging stations across the country is so important. So whether we're talking about electric vehicles or other technologies that are reshaping transportation, you're right. It's not just does the technology exist, it's how do we make sure it's safe? How do we make sure it's economical? How do we make sure that it gets out to people in an equitable way, that we're dealing with the climate implications? And that's exactly why a department like mine exists, beginning with that mission of safety.
And one of the implications of this climate crisis are these extreme weather events. Whether linked to climate change or not, we are seeing quite a few extreme weather events just in the last week. We've been reporting every day about deaths related to such a thing. But I wonder how your department can be linked to trying to move the country in the right direction when it comes to the climate crisis. And I think about weather events that might make certain modes of transportation or certain roads more dangerous and what you can do from your department on that.
Absolutely. Think about the lifetime of a road. When you're making a decision about where to put in a highway, that's potentially a 50-year decision. And yet we know the climate may be different in 10 years, let alone 50. So we've got to plan for those changes. But the biggest thing we got to do is make sure the changes are not going to be as bad as they could be. Look, so much depends on putting less carbon dioxide into the air. And it turns out, if you look at the whole US economy, the biggest source of greenhouse gases across our economy is actually the transportation sector. I mean, just think about it, right? All of our cars, trains, planes, buses, and so on. But that also means transportation could be the biggest part of the solution. And it's things like we were talking about with electrification of vehicles, but also just making it possible to get around in more climate-friendly ways. You know, the better job we do with things like excellent transit and public transportation, the less you got to get in a car in the first place, whether it's electric or not.
One of the things that I remember from the beginning of one of your books, Shortest Way Home, was that you began as mayor in the middle of a big snowstorm. And it actually struck me. It's something I laugh about sometimes when I think about it in a snowstorm, that you said that the handling of a snowstorm poorly by a mayor can detonate your political career. I imagine, and I know as a New Yorker, a lot of the frustration with that has to do with transportation. Here in New York, is the subway working? When it's not, we're cursing de Blasio, whether that's fair or not. I'm wondering, your time as a mayor, how applicable it can be in this particular department.
Absolutely. When you're a mayor, you think a lot about how to make sure people are where they need to be and supporting people in doing that. The thing about the Department of Transportation is you zoom out and look at the entire picture, whether it's about being able to move from Chicago to Tokyo, or whether it's being able to move around a rural area in Oklahoma, or being able to get to Brooklyn from Manhattan on time. All of that is something that our department touches. And so I think a lot from that mayor's eye view, because in the end, we're really trying to support the mayors and the local leaders out there in getting their job done. I don't think all of the answers have to come from Washington, but a lot of the money is going to come through Washington. And we've got to make sure those taxpayer dollars are well spent.
One of the other things that I know that you've spoken about, but I wonder if you can tell us here also, is how the Department of Transportation can intersect with racial justice and sort of the history of some highways in this country being in question in that way, and what your department can do about that now.
Yeah, I know at first glance, when you're thinking about racial justice, the Department of Transportation may not be the first part of the government to come to mind. But then just think about the history of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks. That was about equitable access to transit and transportation. So it's always been part of our story. Now we have an opportunity, I think a historic one, to do better than America's done in the past. Highways, which were an otherwise remarkable and in many ways wonderful development in the 1950s, were a huge part of the American story, but something terrible happened along the way. And that was often the deliberate use of things like highway developments to cut right through predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, sometimes destroying what had been thriving middle-class areas in our cities. We've got a chance to get it right this time, both making sure we do no harm with the investments that are going to come, but also making sure we're connecting people to opportunity instead of distancing people from opportunity. And that affects where every road goes, where every subway goes, how we place these electric vehicle charging stations. It goes into things like air quality. Communities of color are more likely to experience things like asthma because of poor air quality. Once again, often because of things like highways going through neighborhoods that didn't have the power to resist when those decisions were made.
I think much of what you've laid out sounds great and is something that most people would want, whether it be what you just discussed or climate change, access to charging stations for electric vehicles. But the big question on a lot of it is, how much does it cost and how do you pay for it, especially when we're in an economic crisis? How do you address the criticism that these types of things are too expensive?
So the really important thing to remember, especially when it comes to infrastructure spending, is that these are investments that pay for themselves. And they're investments that need to be made together. Any one of us can hope to purchase a car, but no one of us can hope to build a highway out of our own personal funds. Same thing with a subway system, a railway. These are systems that depend by their very nature on us coming together, collecting revenue, and making sure that those tax dollars go to something good. But the economic opportunity that can be unlocked by quality transportation options makes everything else grow. And so unlike what we've been told in the past about things like tax cuts for the wealthy, we were told those would pay for themselves, and it turns out they don't. The reverse is true with good infrastructure spending. A dollar well spent is a dollar we can't afford not to spend.
I also want to ask you about airlines while I have you, because it's one of the big question marks. Of course, the general question, as is true of anything in our lives right now, is it safe? But the other thing that I think with airlines in particular, a lot of Americans are experiencing is, let's say you have to get on an airplane for work. You've got to check a bunch of different airlines' websites to even determine, let's say, which airline is blocking the middle seat anymore. And if that's not going to make you feel comfortable, let's say you do have asthma or some type of condition where you're really worried about having to be in that confined space with other people. It's very confusing right now. Do you think that there should be some type of overarching rules to keep people safe on airlines? Is that something that should come from the federal government?
I think in many ways it's very important for there to be federal leadership on this. This is part of why President Biden's executive order on masking and safe travel was so important. Before President Biden acted, these airlines had to make decisions one at a time. And as a traveler, as you said, you'd have to sift through what all the different airlines are doing and make your own decision about whether they were safe. We don't do requirements where there's not a good reason, but things like that mask mandate, not just on the plane, but in the airport, and us enforcing that rule, that settles that question so that individual airlines don't have to, and lets everybody know that that baseline of safety is being met. And we think, knowing that it's going to be safe, even if it involves a rule, in the end, that's going to help the airlines too, because it builds confidence about the safety of travel.
You mentioned those executive actions from President Biden. Let's talk about some more of his plans. This American Rescue Plan with its $1.9 trillion price tag. Tell me about how the Department of Transportation and the recovery of modes of transportation in our country is intertwined in that. I know in some ways it is.
Yeah, so the rescue plan is focused on the things that we have to do right away to deal with the pandemic. A lot of it's around vaccines, getting those doses out to the sites and getting the shots in arms. But it does deal with things like transit too. Look, a lot of our transit agencies, your bus systems, subways, across the country in big communities and small are on the verge of collapse because in that lockdown period, especially early on, nobody was using them. They didn't collect any fares. We cannot afford to have a transit system collapse, especially for essential workers who don't have the option of working from home, who rely on these means of getting safely to work. And that includes a lot of healthcare workers. So this rescue package includes targeted dollars that go to things like transit and other areas that are hurting right now because we need them up and running for America to function.
You are the first openly gay cabinet member. I just wonder about the significance of that to you. I know it was something to see your husband holding the Bible as you were sworn in by a female vice president. I'm just wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the significance to you and what it feels like to break a barrier.
Yeah, you could really feel the history swirling around us when the vice president was swearing me in with my husband Chasten at my side. I think it was one more example of how the Biden-Harris administration really is a new day in terms of representation. But part of what my mind went back to was the fact that there have been times in living memory where you couldn't have any job in the federal government if you were gay. If you look into the history of things like the Lavender Scare, what went on in the 1950s and the 1960s, never mind more recent things like being a presidential appointee or serving in the military, even just being a bookkeeper or an astronomer, thousands of people lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods because of that kind of discrimination right in our federal government, within the lifetimes of people some of whom are working and living in Washington, D.C. right now. And so it's a really encouraging sign about the change that can happen, but also a reminder that we got a long way to go.
Mm. You are, in addition to being the first openly gay cabinet member, you also have been very open about your faith, which is not something that we see all the time in politics, or if there is a mention of faith, it might be more so that a mention rather than really living that way, than being married in the church like you and Chasten were. I myself am a member of the Christian community, and I've been confused about the church's messaging on LGBTQ issues. And I know in the past, I'm going to read something that you said, just so I get it right, that what you said, you hope that teachings about inclusion and love win out over what I personally consider to be a handful of scriptures that reflect the moral expectations of the era in which they were recorded, which I thought, like everything, most of the things that you say, was a phenomenal way to put it. But I wonder, for you as a member of both the LGBTQ community and a member of the church community, with such visibility now and being in a position of representation for both of those communities, just what you sort of personally feel about the messaging in that way, and what you'd like to see as far as clarity on what that means.
Well, I think this is a conversation that has to happen among believers. And obviously, this is totally separate from my role in government. There's a very good reason why we have a separation of church and state. But as a citizen, as an individual, as a married gay man, and as a believer, I think about this a lot. And sometimes I do feel like we have to sort of defend the LGBTQ community within the church. Then again, there are a lot of times when I feel like I'm defending the church in the LGBTQ community or the progressive community, especially because there's so many people in our community whose experience with faith or experience with religion was one of exclusion and one of hurt. And making sure to connect people with a different experience, a more inclusive vision of what faith can mean. I think that's something that is very much alive in the Christian community and more broadly across communities of faith, but only if we talk about it, only if we really explore these issues together. And at the end of the day, I believe that certainly the faith that I subscribe to and the faith tradition that I'm part of, it's about compassion, it's about love, it's about lifting one another up. And that is a message that should have a lot to say to the LGBTQ community, if we can make sure that that message is delivered in a way that's compassionate and open.
Absolutely. Thank you. I really appreciate you answering that question. One of the other things with our audience, with them being mostly high schoolers and college students or recent college graduates, your age is very inspiring to our audience. That's one of the things that we've heard quite a bit. I know that you were 29 when you became mayor, which is how old I am now, which makes me feel severely underaccomplished, by the way. But being the age that you were as you were going through the presidential campaign, you're on debate stages with people. And I mean, in some cases, literally the president actually double your age. I wonder if you ever feel any type of imposter syndrome. That's one of the things our viewers actually are wondering about too.
Yeah, I think you'd be crazy not to. I mean, when you find yourself standing next to people as accomplished as the people who ran for president, of course you wonder if you're measuring up. But your level of support tells you whether you're hitting a chord. And right now I'm joining this cabinet of extraordinarily accomplished, capable, and often very established people. And it's very important to me to do a good job among them and to do a good job by them. But the great thing about public service is that you have an opportunity to deliver. Definitely when you're a mayor, I mean, you're on the hook every day, and if you do a good job, nobody cares how old you are. Nobody cares if you're gay. Nobody cares about anything in your life so much as whether you're making their lives go better, picking up the trash, plowing the snow, growing the city. And I think about that a lot in this Department of Transportation role too. Right? My job is to make sure that people and goods can move safely around this country, whether it's across town or around the world. And doing that job is something that is independent of all the other kind of things you carry with you into a role. But I also hope that being young will be a virtue. I'm actually almost smack at the median age of the United States population right now, which means about half the country is older than me and about half the country is younger than me. And so knowing that I'm one of the youngest people in a position like this makes me feel kind of pressure to bring that voice in, especially on issues like climate, where 2050 is not some abstract, distant point in the future. It's a time that people my age and younger are preparing for in our personal lives. And the decisions we make in 2021 are frankly going to decide whether America is a good place to live in 2050 or even 2025.
Mm-hmm. So for you personally, 2024, 2028?
2021 is the year we're in, and I got a job to do. So that's my focus right now.
All right, thank you. Okay, last question for you, just quickly, just while I have a sitting cabinet member and we know what's happened with impeachment, but I'm just wondering if you think that the former president should be criminally charged now that the impeachment proceedings are over.
The most important thing about the criminal legal process is it's totally independent from politics. And so I know that there are people who have their jobs to do who are looking at various issues, and I'll be watching that as any citizen would be. But right now, our focus is on delivering in the job that we have. And I know that's what propels the president and all of us that he's tasked to bring results for the American people.